Paznia, Paznia, which of course is Serbian for Achtung, Achtung. Yeah, you know it. Well, here we are, episode 23, and still no sign of language fatigue. We could do Croatian next week, Montenegrin the week after, and Bosnian the week after that, and guess what? I'd use the same script because they're all the same language. The Balkans, as complicated as Europe gets. Well, what we could really do with on this podcast, and by the way, we are in my garden here in West London. It's a beautiful sunny day at the end of the August heat wave. There is the council mowing the park lawn behind, so you may hear the occasional rattle of my council tax being frittered.
The hum of traffic.
The hum
in
of
the
traffic
air and on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is really happening live. We're not in some soundproof booth on a boiling hot day. Anyway, what we need is a proper, serious book writing historian, not a waffling comic. So who's this I spy across the kitchen? Why, it's none other than James Holland, author of the best-selling Normandy 44, available at good and indeed bad bookshops and piled high in airports lately. James, welcome.
Thank you.
How is the book doing?
Yeah, doing all right, I think. You know, it's always a bit kind of exposing having a book out, but we're kind of sort of a couple of months in now, and it's
they want you to write another one.
Yeah, Sicily.
All right, brilliant, excellent.
Well, all that mafia stuff.
Now, 80 years ago today, on September the 10th, 1939, if you're listening on day one of our release, that is, two momentous things happened. Firstly, the Canadians declared war. And in a moment, James will explain why it took them a week to join in. And also on this day, the British lost their first submarine, HMS Oxley, sunk off the coast of Norway, sadly by another British submarine, HMS Triton.
But British submariners, as we've discussed, did get a bit better in the war.
Yeah, that is the truth. Is the phony war is often seen as the phony war because the army are lobbing turnips at each other because they haven't got any hand grenades in France and all that sort of stuff. But the Navy are getting busy. And they're getting on
right
it.
From the word go.
They're right from the word go, and because after all, the plan is to blockade. Churchill's back. Winston is back. Signals the fleet to itself.
Yes, exactly. The Athenia is sunk on day one.
Yeah.
The liner going across the Atlantic.
Yep.
And
Battle of the River Plate isn't far off, is it?
No, it's at the end of the year, but it's a few months down the line. But yes, it's all, first forwards. I mean, the naval war is not a phony war at all. No,
and a proper assertion of Royal Naval dominance right at the start with things like Plate, where you're not coming down to the South Atlantic.
Yes, and it actually exposes the fatal flaw of the Z plan, which is the German pre-war rebuilding of the Kriegsmarine of the German Navy. And what they do is they focus, although they're planning to build a large number of U-boats, actually the focus is on building
prestigious battleships,
prestigious surface fleet. Which is pointless because, of course, for that to be effective, first of all, they've got to get through the blockade, which is not going to be easy because it's blockaded by the Royal Navy, which is the world's largest. And secondly, you really need overseas bases from which to refuel and revittle. And of course, they can't do that because they haven't got any because they were taken away in 1919.
But even when they end up later in the war with those overseas bases, they don't do what the Royal Navy did as its habit. For whenever you were in port, you refueled. And the Bismarck, of course, goes to Brest, doesn't refuel, runs out of fuel, goes to the bottom.
Schoolboy error, and that's because they're kind of inexperienced surface fleet.
Yeah.
And they've lost all what they did know from the kind of First World War.
Anyway.
But yes, Canada. So Canada takes a little bit of time. But I mean, they're dominions. It's the dominions of the British Empire. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Rhodesia.
Australians are straight in, but they have the government who say, well, we're British to our bootstraps, English to our bootstraps, whatever he says, and which of course doesn't pan out well for him politically at home in the end.
No.
But the Australians come straight in. The South Africans definitely are and are because they've got their own internal political problem of there are people who are Boer South Africans who for some reason don't really like the British Empire that much.
But fortunately, Jan Smuts does now.
Yeah, and Smuts has
having been on the side of the Boers in the Anglo-Boer War. He's come round to the other side.
Yeah, so you've got all the complexity of the different countries, and Canada of course have got their own. They've got their own issues with the French Canadian population and what to do about them and whether you can conscript, and because the Canadians don't get round. They never get around to conscription. No.
And it's interesting, of course, that they're exposed because of the Atlantic supply lines. And I think what really stiffens their resolve is those early forays and sinkings and things. And the Athenia is certainly kind of puts the jitters up people, particularly in Canada, and they just think, holy moly, because I think the Athenia was heading for Canada rather than the United States. And that makes them think, oh, hang on a minute, actually we are in this, whether we like it or not. And so I think declaring war seen as a kind of sort of a natural sort of follow through, really.
Other 10th of September. So, what's happening in Burma on the 10th of September?
Good. It's 1944. Well, obviously,
in 44, for instance.
Yeah, in 1944. Well, they're kind of moving south into Burma, aren't they? The British 14th Army, Anglo-Indian 14th Army, I should say. They're moving into Burma following the great victory of Imphal.
So they're capitalising on Imphal.
Yeah, they're pushing forward and waiting for instructions, really. You know, because the British are going, well, hang on, we don't really want you to go back into Burma and do this huge invasion again. Yeah. And Slim is thinking, well, I've just smashed the Japanese 15th Army. We need to kind of exploit the success. How are we going to do it? So all that's going on. And then in Italy, you've got the assaults on the Gothic line. Right.
And a thing that, in fact, my dad brought my attention to this because he's been looking into it, is the Germano. So
yes.
So Ox and Bucks, which is my sort of family connection to that, they fight a battle in Germano, and they are so smashed up by it. Basically, one of their battalion is, I can't remember which one it is dissolved after because it's a village within reach of naval bombardment, isn't it?
Yes.
It's on a ridge on the Gothic line, and the British send a reconnaissance up. Think there's a battalion there. There's a brigade there of Austrian mountain troops, if I'm right. So super
Burnsjäger.
Burnsjäger, and so. We're overlooking the Po Valley. So the idea is you unlock the Po Valley by taking this ridge.
So Germano itself is not overlooking. It's not overlooking the Po Valley at that stage. So what you've got is the Apennines creep up the leg of Italy and kind of sort of veer kind of westwards in this big arc. But the mountains sort of run right down to the Adriatic coast, and it's kind of sort of around Ravenna that it starts to kind of ease into the Po Valley, and suddenly that's the kind of flat bit before you get to the foothills of the Alps. And so that's the great goal, is to get there, because the moment the Allies can get into the Po Valley, it's obviously a lot flatter and it's much easier to use your huge material advantage in mechanisation. But in the mountains, it's much more difficult. And Oliver Leese is the commander of the 8th Army. The 5th Army is attacking in the centre of the Gothic line. And 8th Army is attacking on the Adriatic side. So having been side by side for Monte Cassino and the Battle of Cassino, Operation Diadem, the fall of Rome, back in May, very early June 1944, they then switch and make the switch across. And Leese's dispositions are really, really weird and make no military sense whatsoever. I mean, he's basically promoted above his capabilities as an army commander.
So he's a corps commander, really?
At absolute best.
Right.
And he makes this very odd decision. And actually, I read a book some years ago about the last year of the war in Italy, and actually decided to focus on Germano because I thought it was a really interesting case. It was one of those ones where it was a tiny little Italian village which should, on the face of it, have kind of just... the war should have completely bypassed it. But because of this change of access of advance that Leese does and his weird dispositions, and I can't quite remember the absolute details of it, but it's where he puts his armoured divisions compared to where he puts his infantry and all the rest of it. Suddenly Germano comes on the front line, and the Typhoon of Steel just goes straight through Germano, and this little peaceful village in the kind of foothills of the Apennines overlooking the Adriatic Sea just gets absolutely obliterated. And I was trying to find someone, a witness, an Italian civilian witness, who lived through this, and we couldn't find any through our kind of sort of ANPI sources, which is the kind of national partisan organisation. So eventually we thought, well, let's just go up to Germano and see what's what and have a look around and everything. Well, anyway, we got there, kind of needed a pit stop, went for a cup of coffee. There was an elderly bloke sitting in the coffee shop. We started chatting to him. Turns out he was kind of 10 years old, 12 years old when it came. Could remember absolutely everything.
Bloody hell.
And, an hour later, I had my story. It was amazing. And it is it's like a lot of these little, it's Gopping little village now. Yeah. I mean, it used to be absolutely beautiful. The setting's amazing. Yeah. But all new buildings because it was just completely trashed.
And Leese was fired, wasn't he?
Leese was fired eventually, yeah. He was sort of promoted. He was promoted
very
weirdly.
Often people got fired upwards.
Fired upwards, yeah. So in an upward trajectory from a 4-inch mortar to Burma, where the first thing he did was commit an absolutely just ridiculous faux pas. Got on the wrong side of Bill Slim and effectively sacked him as 14th Army commander. I mean, just absolutely barking, and was forced to kind of
retract,
and then he was absolutely fired as army group.
But
commander.
you mentioned Rome there, because we talked about Rome. Rome came up a couple of weeks ago, I think, and we were talking about...
Yes, because it falls on the 4th of June.
Because it's the 4th of June, and it's seen as a sort of upstaging of D-Day by some, or ignored because of D-Day by others, and Clark's reputation. He should have encircled the Germans and destroyed them rather than gone for Rome as a big political target. So we talked about it in relation to Paris, because taking these capital cities is obviously very sort of politically significant in terms of a knockout political battle.
Yes,
as a knockout blow. But
well, the whole point that Rome should have been a really easy victory.
Well, and the Germans get away.
Yeah, so it's really interesting, because this all goes back to Operation Diadem, which is Alexander's battle plan. General Alexander, as he is then, or is he Field Marshal by that stage? He's Field Marshal. He's Field Marshal Alexander of Earl Alexander of Tunis, and he is commander of the Allied armies in Italy. So he's the army group commander.
Yep.
It's 5th Army, which is predominantly American, but with some British divisions in it.
Yep.
And 8th Army. I mean, the interesting thing about the Allied armies in Italy, there's something like 23 different nationalities fighting in it, which we've talked about the Brazilians.
Well, and it had been reorganised, because a load of people get drawn down to go back to Britain for D-Day.
And what one has to understand is that although compared to the Germans, the Allied armies in Italy are fantastically well equipped with machinery and air power and all the rest of it. Compared to what they're building up for in Normandy, it's very much the poor relation, and it's got the dregs and all the rest of it. Yeah. Diadem is a brilliantly planned battle, and although the plan doesn't work out exactly as they anticipate it will, the net result is far greater than they initially expect it to be, because basically what they're up against is 2 armies against 2 armies. Yeah. So you've got the German 10th Army, which is the dominant one, and then you've got the German 14th Army as well, which is in reserve. It's the 10th Army which is basically facing off at Cassino. Yeah. And the plan for Diadem is to completely destroy the right flank of the 10th Army and force the 14th and remainder of the 10th and 14th Army back to the Pisa-Rimini line, which is effectively the Gothic line, the next major defensive position that the Germans have in Italy. And obviously capture Rome and attrit the Germans as much as you possibly can in the process of this defeat. What ends up happening is that 10th Army is very, very badly mauled, but not completely annihilated. But the 14th Army is, to all intents and purposes, completely destroyed, which was not on the original task at all. So actually, the net result is better than anticipated, and they do get to Rome. Yeah. Where the criticism has come is that Mark Clark was all out for his own glory and put his own glory ahead of military good sense, didn't do what Alexander said and go straight across to Valmontone, which is this little town on the Via Casalina Highway which leads from Cassino up the Liri Valley to Rome. Yeah. And instead turns on the Alban Hills, faces off 14th Army and tries to get into Rome the back door. And this is all about Mark Clark. The thing about Mark Clark is there is absolutely no question that he was had an arrogance about him. There was no question that he had a vanity about him, and there was no question that he wanted to get Rome for 5th Army. But I would argue that none of those things necessarily mean he was a bad general, and there's lots of vain and arrogant generals.
We've talked about this an awful lot.
Yeah, exactly. But the interesting thing about it is, by where the whole Diadem battle plan goes awry is it is anticipated that the main thrust will be done by 8th Army going down the Liri Valley with the Via Casalina as its access. On their left, they've got the FEC, the French Expeditionary Corps. Yeah. And on the left of them, they've got US 2 Corps. So the idea is that the 8th Army will punch through. The French and the American 2 Corps will be on their flank, sort of a bit behind. And at a certain point, there will be the breakout from 5th Corps, US 5th Corps, from Anzio Beachhead, will then trap the bulk of 10th Army in this kind of encirclement. What actually happens is that the French and 2 Corps get way ahead of the 8th Army and push them up. So the 10th Army has already been pushed over to the east. Okay. So what is interesting is in the final play out, not a single German soldier retreats down the Via Casalina. They actually retreat down routes way further to the east. Okay. So Clark's point is, yes, I'll go to Valmontone, but Valmontone is not going to trap the 10th Army because it's played out differently. On the other hand, to go all out to Valmontone, I am then cutting across directly in front of the German 14th Army arrayed along the Caesar line, which is running kind of roughly west to east, just to the south, about 15 miles south of Rome. And he says that's just insane. And Mark Clark is, like a lot of Americans, is a broad front kind of guy rather than a kind of Schwerpunkt kind of guy. So he turns his forces to face off 14th Army. And a lot of his commanders go, that's insane. Why don't we just go all out for Valmontone? Then we can turn left at the Via Casalina, and that can be our access, and we'll get into Rome quicker. And they're probably right. But Clark just thinks, I don't like this whole kind of crossing across these German flanks. I'm going to turn in. He then gets into a slugging match.
Yeah.
And then suddenly this gap is discovered around Monte Artemisio and the town of Velletri, where there is just a gap in the line of 14th Army, the German 14th Army. And he's managed to exploit that with the 36th Texan Division and get through. And then the whole thing unfolds, and that's how they're able to destroy the 14th Army.
So what he's trying to do is tidy the battle up by... The Germans have deployed in an unexpected way, so he's facing up to them to tie them down, to engage them, to write them down. He's basically doing what the overall plan has asked him to do and adapted to circumstance.
Yes, and he has all these different contingencies, which he's already war-gamed beforehand. And Alexander keeps going to him, well, that's great, but don't forget to go all out for Valmontone. Right. But, of course, this is before the battle happens, and this is in the expectation that this is going to be the crucial thrust, driving out of Cisterna and out of Anzio towards Valmontone and trapping the vast bulk of 10th Army. But by the time that the breakout from Anzio happens...
They're not there anymore.
They're not there anymore.
So you can't... So he engages and ties them down where he finds them rather than where the plan tells him to.
And militarily, what he does, I think, makes a huge amount of sense. The narrative, though, that has been pursued ever since is that Mark Clark was a total bastard, was doing two fingers up at the British and trying to snub them and, failed in what Alexander did. And Raleigh Trevelyan, in his book on this, says... As a quote from Harold Macmillan. Harold Macmillan was the British War Cabinet member who was based in Italy. Yeah. And he was really, really good. He was like bezies with Alexander. Yeah. They really were thick as thieves. They talked to each other every single day. And according to Raleigh Trevelyan, who interviewed him in the 60s or 70s or whenever, Harold Macmillan said, I've never seen Alex so angry in my entire life as he was when he learned that Mark Clark wasn't going all out for Valmontone. The interesting, and this has been repeated forever by subsequent historians, including by Anthony Beevor in his big book on the Second World War and all the rest of it. The point is that I then wrote to Raleigh Trevelyan and said, when did Harold Macmillan say this? Because in your book you don't source that quote. And he said, oh, well, it obviously was a long time ago and I can't quite remember, but I had a conversation with him and that's what he said. And I said, okay, well, that's just interesting because you didn't actually source it. So I then went back to all the diaries of all the main players involved. And Harold Macmillan kept a very, very detailed diary at the time, and he doesn't mention Alexander being in a strop at all at the time. General Harding, who is Alexander's chief of staff, doesn't mention it either and just goes, the battle's gone according to plan, it's all gone fantastically well, we're thrilled with the Americans. Oliver Leese, who absolutely hates Mark Clark's guts and is just only too happy to stick the knife in at every available opportunity, he says, I've got to hand it to the Americans, they've done a bloody good job. Kirkman, who is the 13th Corps commander, doesn't mention it, says the Americans have done really, really well. So no one at the time is quibbling.
So where's this come from?
It's come from resentment of 8th Army junior officers who later on in life have written books about it because they're pissed off because Italy got relegated to second thing and they're just looking to kind of, get off their chest their kind of general pissed offness about how the Italian campaign was fought and how the legacy of it. And I think that's where it derives with a good old bit of good old-fashioned Americophobia.
There's an ambulance coming to deal with that really sick burn you just delivered there, James.
So, and it is really, really interesting, and once you... And it's one of these classic things where you have the myth, and then once you deconstruct it and actually get into the nitty-gritty and look at the contemporary sources on this, you find quite a different picture emerges. And when I was looking into this, I had no axe to grind or, I went at it as neutral as I possibly could. I didn't particularly, have any... I wasn't out to kind of...
It's not your quarrel.
It wasn't my quarrel. But it was very, very interesting reading all Mark Clark's day-to-day diaries, which he kept. And his letters back to his wife and all the rest of it. And they just reveal a very, very interesting character. And all his anxiety about 8th Army beating 5th Army to to Rome is all before the battle begins. The moment the battle starts, it all stops because he can see that that's not going to be a problem because 8th Army are way behind.
Yeah.
And there is this rivalry building up, which Leese absolutely fans the flames of just by winding him up. He just can't resist it. And what Clark says is, and famously he says, I'm going to shoot any British soldier that comes into Rome. He doesn't. He says, I'm going to, I don't want any 8th Army soldiers in that, which is not the same thing at all because, of course, there's British troops within Rome, within 5th Army, who are in Rome, and he's only too happy about that. And the big point is that the other thing is that Clark, because of his elevated position, knows exactly what is going on and knows that Italy is about to be relegated. And he also knows that he lives in a media age and that actually it's really, really important for the American public to get behind the Italian campaign. And the best way to do that is have pictures of the commanding army the army commander in front of signs of Roma and to have this sold as a kind of big American triumph. From a media point of view, that is really fantastic PR at a strategic level as well.
Were the mafia involved?
Not in this instance.
Right, time for a short break, or as the Bosnians would say, vidimo se oscuro. Well, welcome back. Next week's show will be the first of 9 daily podcasts marking the 75th anniversary of Operation Market Garden, a pod too far. Any listeners with questions, stories or connections to the extraordinary story of Arnhem, Nijmegen, Eindhoven, 30 Corps or any other aspect of the battle, please do get in touch using the hashtag WeHaveWays on Twitter or by email to wehavewayspodcast@gmail.com. So it's wehavewayspodcast as one word at gmail.com. Right, so some questions. This comes from someone calling themselves Avro Vulcan 617, which of course is the Vulcan.
Is that red and white?
That's the Vulcan that did the Port Stanley attack.
Yes.
Morning, Al, and congrats to you and James for We Have Ways. There's a strong start. What are your thoughts on the phenomenon seen over Germany and Japan called Foo Fighters? It was the famous band. The Germans and Japs thought it was an Allied secret weapon, and we and the Americans thought it was an Axis weapon. I mean, basically, it's people seeing strange things in aeroplanes high up in the sky at disorienting speeds. I was kind of think, you didn't, I mean, we're not equipped to fly at 20,000 feet at 300 miles an hour. Our brains aren't actually hardwired for that experience, are they? So I'm never surprised that people see things when they're up in the sky and like playing tricks through perspex and
so now goes far
and all stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, because the Germans did have experimental bonkers things like the ME-163 and also which for those who don't know is a rocket plane that looks like a sort of squashed dart.
Yes, and it's fueled by
propellant. It's not got a jet engine.
Something peroxide.
That's right. Yes, it's one of those. It's a rocket engine. So it's basically one element meets the other element, and they explode violently, and off you go.
Yeah.
And it had a little sled. So the aeroplane, and it really does look. It looks like a sort of. It looks like a bat or a squashed dart. I mean, you look at it and you think, I'm not getting in that. Jesus Christ, right? But it could reach very, very high speeds.
It can only fly for about 8 minutes or something.
8 minutes, it'll go straight up.
Yep.
Straight up really, really fast. Drop its sled as it took off. And then the idea was they'd come down, attack a bomber force, because they had a cannon in the nose or something.
Yep.
Attack the American bombers, and then you'd try and land it. I mean,
with no fuel. So you have to
glide.
Your engine has to come down.
Yes, it's basically a rocket pad glider.
Yep.
And
absolutely bonkers.
Bonkers. And you think of the time, the effort, the expenditure, the poor pilot. I mean, it's...
Yeah.
Did Winkle Brown fly one?
Yeah, he did. He flew. He did. After the end of the war, Eric Winkle Brown, of course, legendary test pilot. He went. He did a tour of Germany, going to all the experimental works, Peenemünde and the like, and basically just trying all the ones that he possibly could and interviewing top Luftwaffe types and scientists and all the rest of it, and trying all these. And what's really interesting is a lot of these kind of airframes then do kind of winkle their way into, no pun intended, into British aircraft designed post-war and these jets and stuff. But it's absolutely incredible. They also, don't forget that the Germans have also developed loads and loads of ground-to-air missiles as well. So it's not just V1s and V2s that they're developing. There's a whole host of other ones as well. These are hurtling up into the sky at kind of stupid speed. So I'm sure all these are the sort of things that are contributing to the kind of rumours of the Foo Fighters.
And did they not have an air-to-air fly-by-wire missile thing. I mean,
gosh, yeah, maybe. I don't know.
Because both sides were pushing this envelope, and the Allies have the proximity fuse, of course, which goes off when it's near something, as the name would suggest.
Yeah.
And they are pushing it all. All the technology is being pushed the entire time, and I mean, obviously, so often with the Germans, you look at it and you think you're spending a lot of effort on a bright idea here that might not work.
Yeah. That almost certainly won't.
Almost certainly won't. I mean, the ME-163 wasn't a particularly effective fighter plane, was it?
No, not at all. No. I mean, no, because what you've got is you've got an element of something which is really exciting and potential and has a huge amount of potential, but it hasn't been given the research and development time it requires because of the
time pressure
of the war.
You're losing the war.
And you're losing the war, exactly. And that's the problem. It's also the problem with their jet program. I mean, the jet engines they developed, the UMO, is not a very good jet engine because it hasn't got enough of the right parts because they're running out of resources.
Well, they haven't got they can't get the metals for the blades, can they?
No.
So they have a real problem with blade failure, with the metallurgy in the blades keeps failing. And the ME-262, they get something like 8 hours out of the engine maximum.
I think it might be a tiny bit more than that, but it's really not very much.
It's not much.
No.
And of course, they're extremely vulnerable taking off and landing. So in the end, the Allies don't bother trying to dogfight them. They wait for them to land, don't they? And then shoot them down.
But the Foo Fighters, I mean, one of the things, this is sort of, UFOs as well.
Yes.
Little sort of,
round. We're avoiding the Nazi flying saucer here, aren't we?
Well, yeah. Except there's a very shadowy figure, a very leading SS engineer called Hans Kammler. No one knows quite what happened to him, and it's one of the sort of great untold mysteries. And he was certainly doing all sorts of wacky, weird research projects. And one of the ones that he was definitely looking into, there's absolutely no doubt about this, was the hunt for 0 point, which is where you create this force field where there's no gravity, and if you've got no gravity, obviously you can do whatever you like. And there is speculation that somewhere in a forest in the in Czechoslovakia, he'd cracked it or almost cracked it, and that apparently some video or some film footage of this experiment going on where they have actually created it, and this was then squirreled away to the US, which is where you get area whatever it is down in Arizona.
51.
Whatever it is. And it's probably all bonkers, but it is really interesting, and I think that's where a lot of this kind of UFO stuff comes from, and Foo Fighters are all kind of linked into that. But I didn't know about Japanese ones, I've got to say.
I don't know about Japanese
Foo Fighters. I thought it was just a German one, but I'm happy to be corrected on that.
And
one.
it's Foo for fire, isn't it? It means fur. It's something to do with.
Yes, because the whole point was that there's this bright light, and it seems like a little orb that's kind of hurtling towards you, but no one ever seems to have been shot down by a Foo Fighter. It just seems to be a
what if they were? They never lived to tell the tale, of course. Which confirmation bias there.
Yes,
right,
there you go.
David Yields says, love the show. Just listen to your episode discussing memoirs. Have either of you read Spike Milligan's memoirs? A great insight to the average Tommy for all that he made it hilarious. Well, yes, I'm an enormous fan of these books. And
literally the best title of a book ever.
Oh, well, yeah.
Hitler, my part in his downfall.
Well, and Rommel, his part in my downfall. And
just really funny.
They are really fantastic. You look at Milligan's experience. So he's conscripted, and it starts off. The Neville Chamberlain on the radio says we declared that we were at war with Germany. I wasn't so keen on the we, is what he says, right? And he doesn't go. According to his memoir, he didn't go, and he sort of avoided it for a bit because he didn't like the idea at all. And he wanted to play trumpet, and his memoirs of his being a teenager, basically, he plays trumpet in bands, and he does a lot of athletics and stuff, and being a comic and basically changing the entire face of British comedy is not on his mind at that point. So he's conscripted, goes into the artillery, and then he's in Bexhill-on-Sea waiting for the invasion. And there's a great story about he sees a German plane, he throws a brick at it, and the plane crashes, and he shouts, "I hope you crash!" Throws a brick at it, and crashes. He goes, "Well, strike one to Milligan." But he does all stuff about how they've got the old First World War artillery pieces, and they shout "bang" because they don't have any ammunition to drill with. And he paints a pretty. I mean, it's all it's all japes with his mates, which are really, really interesting, and his friendships and the friendships he forms and how important they are to him, and how their friendships and the banter and all that is the thing that sort of keeps them going, which is really, 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 really interesting. I mean, I actually think, kind of, if they weren't written by Spike Milligan, they might be taken more seriously as a sort of a first-person account of what it was like being a gunner in the Second World War. And then he goes to Tunisia, and the account of sailing to Tunisia on the boat is fascinating. And the thing that always strikes me about it, and I think it ties in with the thing you talk about a lot, is at no point in his memoirs does Milligan complain that he's hungry, right? Everywhere he goes, he's extremely well. He doesn't like a lot of the food, but there's plenty of it. And there's a Christmas dinner they have, I think, in Tunisia before they sail for Italy, which is ridiculous. And you read about it, and it's all this plum pudding, and you think, here is, like, and it's all served up as a comic memoir. Here is an eyewitness account of a bloke right at the bottom, literally, of the army food chain. He's a gunner in the artillery, and this is his life, and this is what it's like, and this is how well victualled they are, and actually how well looked after they are. Because the fascinating bit when he loses when he goes into combat fatigue, and he goes on about, I went mad, I went doolally. He talks about it like that. He's sent down to forward observe, and he loses his nerve, and they've got a new commanding officer, and the commanding officer doesn't like, and they don't like each other, and this major's not sympathetic, this battery commander's not sympathetic to Milligan at all, and because Milligan's kind of like the court jester in the outfit, and he doesn't want the new CO doesn't want that, and they have a personality clash, and his view on battle fatigue is, well, then it's your own fault because you're a time waster and you're not serious about any of this. But his evacuation, his rehabilitation, you get the whole thing. They get him out and they get him to sleep. They give him a pill and he sleeps for a day and a half and all this sort of stuff, which is what you read about. How they approach battle fatigue and combat fatigue, and what they decide to do is you get people rested, you get them shaved, you get them showered in a forward area. You don't take them back. But then they realise that Milligan's too far gone, and he ends up in this house in Italy with loads of other loonies, as he calls them, with Harry Seacombe, of course, and they form a loose concert party, and the basic idea is the army's, well, look, you amuse yourselves because we can't send you forward anymore, your nerve's gone, but that's okay, and they're well looked after, and they go round entertaining the troops, and they're such an interesting, they're hilarious, and there's no doubt that there's some hindsight at work, and there's no doubt that he's clearly jazzed up some of the conversations, as he puts it, but they are absolutely fascinating.
And this is a seed, isn't it?
Yeah, and this, of course. Then, of course, he comes out of the army and he still pals with Seacombe
and co.
And he says Seacombe does this amazing turn where basically when he first meets Harry Seacombe, he watches him shave and he thinks, how was this man ever allowed in the armed forces? Like, because he's going to kill himself with a razor blade. He's so dangerous, like, with a razor blade. And then there's a whole thing. The Seacombe's act is to go at one point is he goes on and he shaves, like, really sort of ridiculously, and that's his turn. And then but the army grants them this space to live like this, and we always think of the 40s, I think, as the olden days when people didn't understand psychology the way we do, and they didn't understand.
But actually, this reveals that they're a lot more on it than.
They're really, really, really on it, and they are.
Well, actually, and also at the end of the Second World War, all those guys that have been released from the prison war camp, they recognise the fact that the worst thing you can do is just shove them straight back home.
Yeah.
They need to decompress, and decompression is such a big important thing of people who are coming out of Afghanistan recently.
Yeah.
But
I know
that's
lots of comics who've done the decompression gig in Cyprus, where I think it's 48 hours or 24 hours in Cyprus, where they basically.
I did that when I came back from Afghanistan.
Well, there you go. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Fascinating. And do you know what? It's such a long time ago since I read those books.
Well,
I just
well, you know what? What I'd like
to
do, James, what I'd like us to do is I'll pick one and I'll read through it and I go, so when he's on the marathon line, what's going on in the big picture and what's going on in the particular? Okay. And then we'll say, and Milligan says this is happening to him. Is that right? Is that possible?
Yeah.
Is he where the map says he ought to be, or is he somewhere else? What's he remembered right? Because he goes Tunisia, Sicily, Italy.
Yes.
And in a heavy gun battery, so with their counter battery fire, they experience quite a lot of, and all that sort of thing. So
I remember a lot more about the Italian one, though. I've read them both. I can't remember anything about the Tunisian one.
Yeah, the First Army stuff's, and there's all this stuff about we are First Army, and I can't remember what all the banter is, but they're shipped to to Tunisia.
I've been all around there. It's
directly.
Fascinating because, of course, it's a lot of the battlefield areas around Tunisia are quite underpopulated.
Yeah.
So a lot of it's still there. I mean, you can go to Sidi Nazir, for example, and the old train halt is still there, and the landscape is exactly as it was. It's
and his
just
sketches are really, really good, are really, really interesting.
Yeah.
Of the locals. Sort of, oh God, another army coming through. Great.
Thanks.
Well, that's all we got time for today. We will revisit Spike Milligan, I promise, because he means as a comic, he means an awful lot to me, and he's such an important figure. But I also think as a source of another way of looking at the Second World War from sort of the ground up, he's an excellent, though possibly entirely unreliable source. Well, that's all we got time for today. Just 7 more sleeps till the whole Ireland gig gets going.
Yep, we'll be back next week with the first of our Market Garden podcasts. I know you all know the story of it. Come on, it takes a beating, doesn't it?
It certainly does. See you next time.
Cheerio.